The most striking example of what the string of pearls can mean in practice came in Sri Lanka. China provided massive loans to Sri Lanka for the construction of Hambantota Port in the country's deep south. The port was commercially unviable from the beginning. Too little traffic, too much debt. When Sri Lanka could not repay its loans, China negotiated a 99-year lease on the port in 2017. A Chinese-controlled port, 99 years, on a strategically vital island positioned precisely at the center of India's most important maritime approaches. Indian strategists were horrified. Pakistan represents perhaps the most sensitive dimension of this encirclement. India and Pakistan have fought 3 full wars and numerous smaller conflicts. They are bitter, nuclear-armed rivals. And China's relationship with Pakistan is intimate, deep, and deliberately cultivated. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, is a $62 billion infrastructure project that runs roads, railways, and pipelines from western China all the way through Pakistan to Gwadar Port on the Arabian Sea. It passes through territory that India claims as its own, the Pakistan-occupied portion of Kashmir. India has protested loudly. China has proceeded regardless. From Beijing's perspective, CPEC is an economic project. From New Delhi's perspective, it is China helping Pakistan build the infrastructure of a future war, and doing so directly through disputed Indian territory. The relationship between India, China, and Pakistan is not a bilateral equation. It is a triangle, and China has for decades been the side of the triangle that connects to both the others. Segment 4. The economic battlefield: trade, tech, and dependency. Here is a fact that makes Indian strategists deeply uncomfortable. Despite the border clashes, despite the strategic rivalry, despite the string of pearls and the Pakistan alliance and the Himalayan standoffs, China is one of India's largest trading partners. In the financial year following the Galwan Valley clash, in which 20 Indian soldiers died, bilateral trade between India and China reached its highest level in history. India buys enormous quantities of Chinese goods: electronics, pharmaceuticals, solar panels, chemical components, machinery. The dependency runs deep into sectors that India considers strategically vital. Approximately 60 to 70% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients used in India's massive generic drug manufacturing industry come from China. India is the pharmacy of the developing world. It supplies affordable medicines to hundreds of millions of people globally, and the raw materials for those medicines come overwhelmingly from China. This is not a comfortable position for a country that considers China its primary strategic rival. India has tried to respond. Following the Galwan clash, the Indian government banned hundreds of Chinese mobile applications, including TikTok, WeChat, and dozens of others, citing national security concerns. The bans were popular domestically and sent a message, but they barely scratched the surface of the underlying economic relationship. India also introduced policies designed to encourage domestic manufacturing and reduce import dependency. The Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, investments in semiconductor manufacturing, efforts to attract companies relocating their supply chains out of China. The results have been mixed. Building domestic manufacturing capacity takes decades, not months. Meanwhile, Chinese goods continue to flow into Indian markets, often at prices that Indian manufacturers cannot compete with. The trade deficit between India and China has grown consistently larger every year, reaching nearly $100 billion in recent years. India sends relatively little to China in return: some iron ore, some cotton, some software services. The imbalance is structural, and it is significant. China has also been deeply present in India's technology ecosystem. Before the bans, Chinese apps like TikTok and ShareIt had hundreds of millions of Indian users. Chinese smartphone manufacturers, Xiaomi, Vivo, Oppo, Realme, dominated the Indian market at the affordable end of the price range, the segment where most Indians buy their phones. That dominance gave Chinese companies not just revenue, but extraordinary access to the data of hundreds of millions of Indian citizens: their locations, their communications, their purchasing behavior, their social connections. The technology dimension of the India-China competition is not simply about apps and smartphones. It is about who builds the infrastructure of the digital future, whose undersea cables carry the internet traffic, whose satellites provide the GPS signals, whose artificial intelligence systems process the data, whose 5G equipment forms the backbone of the next generation of telecommunications. In every one of these domains, China is present, aggressive, and generously funded by a state that treats technological supremacy as a national security priority. India is competing, but it is competing from behind, with fewer resources, and with an economy that remains more entangled with its rival than any strategic doctrine would recommend. Segment 5. The Water Wars. The river that could decide everything. There is a dimension of the India-China rivalry that receives far less attention than nuclear weapons or border patrols or trade deficits. It flows invisibly from the Tibetan Plateau through the mountains and into the great river systems of South and Southeast Asia. Water. China occupies the Tibetan Plateau, the highest plateau on Earth, sometimes called the Third Pole because it holds the largest reserves of fresh water outside the Arctic and Antarctic. From this plateau flow the headwaters of some of the mightiest rivers in Asia: the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Salween, the Brahmaputra, which India calls the Brahmaputra, and which flows through Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and into Bangladesh. The Indus, whose waters feed the agriculture of Pakistan. China sits upstream on all of them. Over the past 2 decades, China has constructed dozens of dams on the upper reaches of rivers that flow into India and the rest of South and Southeast Asia. On the upper Brahmaputra alone, China has built multiple large dams and announced plans for what would be the world's largest hydroelectric project. A dam so massive that Chinese engineers claim it will generate nearly 3 times the electricity of the Three Gorges Dam. This project sits in a seismically active region of extraordinary ecological sensitivity. The downstream implications for river flows, sediment levels, and flooding patterns in India and Bangladesh are potentially enormous. India has no treaty with China governing water sharing on the Brahmaputra. There is a limited data sharing agreement under which China is supposed to provide India with hydrological data during flood season. Even this minimal agreement has been suspended by China multiple times, including during periods of diplomatic tension following the Galwan clash. When the monsoon comes and the rivers run high, India sometimes discovers what is happening upstream only when the flooding has already begun. Water is power. In a region where agriculture still employs hundreds of millions of people, where river-dependent communities stretch across vast territories, the ability to control water flows is a form of strategic leverage that is slower and quieter than a missile strike, but potentially more consequential over the long run. China has built the infrastructure of that leverage over decades. India has watched it happen with limited ability to respond. The dam issue is compounded by the broader question of what Chinese development on the Tibetan Plateau means for glaciers and water security across the entire region. Climate change is already accelerating glacial retreat at alarming rates. The glaciers of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau feed the rivers that provide fresh water to billions of people. As those glaciers shrink, the competition for the water that remains will intensify. That competition will increasingly run through the India-China relationship, and China, sitting upstream, will hold the geographic advantage. Segment 6. The Neighborhood Game. India fights for its own backyard. India has long regarded South Asia as its natural sphere of influence. The smaller nations of the region, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Myanmar, have historically been within India's diplomatic orbit. India shared culture, religion, history, and geography with all of them. New Delhi assumed, often without fully articulating the assumption, that these countries would naturally gravitate toward India on matters of strategic significance. China has spent 20 years systematically challenging that assumption. Nepal is perhaps the most striking example. India and Nepal share an open border, deep cultural ties, and a relationship so intertwined that Nepali citizens can work in India without visas and serve in the Indian Army. For decades, this closeness translated into a default diplomatic alignment. But China has invested heavily in Nepal. Roads, airports, railways, economic agreements. Beijing has cultivated the Nepali Communist Party and other political forces. And in 2020, at the height of the Galwan tensions between India and China, Nepal published a new official map claiming Indian territory around Kalapani and Lipulekh, areas that India administers. The timing was pointed. Sri Lanka, as we have already seen, took the Hambantota port deal and handed China a 99-year lease. The Maldives, a strategically vital island chain sitting in the middle of India's most important sea lanes, has swung between pro-India and pro-China governments with alarming frequency. Bangladesh, a country that was born in 1971 partly through Indian military intervention, has deepened its economic relationship with China significantly. Myanmar, which sits on India's northeastern border and provides China with a corridor to the Indian Ocean, has drifted further into Beijing's orbit following its military coup. Country by country, India's neighborhood has become a contested space. None of these countries have abandoned India entirely. The relationships are complex, multipolar, and driven by genuine national interest calculations on all sides. But the comfortable assumption of a naturally India-aligned South Asia is no longer operational. India has responded with its own neighborhood-first policy, trying to be more attentive, more generous, and more responsive to its neighbors' needs than it historically has been. India has financed infrastructure across the region, extended credit lines, built roads and railways, provided COVID vaccines at scale. It has tried to present itself as a partner that shares something with its neighbors that China fundamentally cannot: geography, culture, history, and a democratic political system. But India faces a structural disadvantage in this competition. China has more money. China builds faster. China asks fewer questions about governance and human rights when it extends its loans and builds its projects. For a small nation with urgent infrastructure needs and limited leverage, the choice between an Indian offer that comes slowly and with conditions and a Chinese offer that comes quickly and without them is not always a straightforward one. Segment 7. The Global Chessboard: India's Strategy to Push Back. India is not simply absorbing Chinese pressure. Over the past decade, and with accelerating urgency in the years following the Galwan Valley clash, India has been building a strategic response. It is a response built on several pillars, and each one tells you something important about how New Delhi reads the challenge it faces. The first pillar is the Quad. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue brings together India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. 4 democracies, 4 major Indo-Pacific powers, and 4 countries that share a deep, if sometimes unspoken, concern about Chinese ambition. The Quad was originally proposed in 2007 by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, but went dormant for years as member countries worried about provoking Beijing. After Galwan, India's enthusiasm for the Quad increased dramatically. The grouping has since upgraded itself from working-level meetings to full leaders-level summits. It coordinates on vaccine distribution, critical technology, supply chain resilience, and increasingly on maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. China regards the Quad with intense suspicion and has publicly called it an Asian NATO, a charge that Quad members carefully deflect, noting that the grouping has no mutual defense commitment. But the strategic signal of the Quad is unmistakable. India, which has for decades jealously guarded its tradition of strategic autonomy and non-alignment, is now willing to sit in a structured multilateral grouping with the United States, Japan, and Australia, and to do so explicitly in the context of maintaining what all 4 members call a free and open Indo-Pacific. The language is diplomatic. The target is understood. The second pillar is military modernization. India has for decades been the world's largest arms importer, a fact that reflects both the scale of its security needs and the historical weakness of its domestic defense industry. Following Galwan, the pace of military investment increased sharply. India accelerated the deployment of troops and infrastructure along the LAC, building roads, tunnels, and helipads in areas that had been deliberately left underdeveloped for decades, out of the misguided fear that good roads would help an invader. India bought emergency stocks of weapons and ammunition. It acquired additional fighter jets. It rushed new mountain warfare equipment to forward positions. India has also been systematically reducing its dependency on Russian military equipment, a long and complicated process since the Indian military is deeply integrated with Russian systems, and diversifying toward American, French, and Israeli suppliers. The emerging defense partnership with the United States in particular represents a transformation in a relationship that was, for decades, cold, suspicious, and hamstrung by Cold War alignments. The third pillar is economic, the attempt to reduce the structural dependency on Chinese manufacturing and investment. This is the hardest pillar to build. You cannot replace 60 years of supply chain integration with a policy announcement. But India is trying, with increasing urgency and increasing international support, to position itself as the alternative manufacturing destination for companies that want to reduce their exposure to China. The demographic advantage India holds, a young, large, English-speaking workforce, is real. The challenge is building the infrastructure, the regulatory environment, and the skills base to translate that advantage into actual factories and actual jobs. Segment 8, The Silent War's Future: Who Wins and What the World Loses. We have traveled across 3,500 kilometers of disputed mountain border. We have followed the debt diplomacy through a dozen countries. We have traced the rivers from their Tibetan sources to the floodplains of Assam. We have watched 2 civilizations, 2 nuclear powers, 2 of the most consequential countries in human history compete for influence across every domain imaginable. So who is winning? The honest answer is that China, at this particular moment, holds more advantages than India. Its economy is roughly 5 times larger. Its military budget is approximately 4 times greater. Its infrastructure across the LAC is significantly more developed. Its Belt and Road network has given it influence across more than 100 countries. It has a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and it has, over the past 2 decades, executed a strategic vision with a patience, consistency, and coordination that democracies find genuinely difficult to match. But winning and winning decisively are different things. China has significant vulnerabilities that India and others have been learning to exploit. Its economy is slowing. Its demographic crisis, the consequence of the one-child policy, is real and growing. Its internal political system, increasingly centralized under Xi Jinping, is losing the adaptability and error correction capacity that made China's rise so spectacular. Countries across Asia that welcomed Chinese investment are now feeling the weight of debt they struggle to repay and political conditions they did not fully anticipate. The backlash to the Belt and Road is real, and it is growing. India, for its part, is at an extraordinary moment in its history. It is now the world's most populous nation. It is one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. It has a young population, a deep technological talent base, and a democratic system that, for all its turbulence and imperfections, gives it a legitimacy and a resilience that authoritarian competitors cannot easily replicate. The countries of the Global South, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, are not reflexively pro-China. They are looking for alternatives. India, carefully and consistently presented, could be one. But the deeper question this documentary has been building toward is not which country wins this silent war. It is what the rest of the world loses if the war continues without resolution. The Indian subcontinent and China together are home to nearly 3 billion people. The rivers that originate on the Tibetan Plateau provide water to another billion. The trade routes that cross the Indian Ocean carry the goods that sustain the global economy. A world in which India and China are locked in permanent, escalating strategic competition is a world in which climate agreements become harder to reach, in which the institutions of global governance become more paralyzed, in which every small country in Asia is forced to choose sides in a conflict it did not create and cannot easily escape. The silent war between India and China is not simply a bilateral story. It is one of the defining stories of the 21st century. It is being fought right now, on frozen mountain ridges and in deep water ports, in technology boardrooms, and in the offices of finance ministers across the developing world. Most people are not watching, but the outcome will shape the world that all of us inhabit, whether we are paying attention or not. The cameras are off, the diplomats are smiling, and somewhere on the line of actual control,